Before we begin, let's be clear about what we're discussing today. An asylum seeker is someone who has fled their home country because of war, persecution, violence, or serious human rights violations. They're seeking protection in another country because returning home would put their life at risk. This isn't about economic migration or people simply looking for better opportunities. Asylum seekers are running from danger. For decades, the United Kingdom was seen as one of the safest destinations for people fleeing persecution. It had strong legal protections, a stable economy, and a reputation for upholding human rights. But something fundamental has changed. Recent policy shifts have made the UK one of the most difficult places in Europe for asylum seekers to find safety and stability. Many are now being forced to leave, either through deportation or because conditions have become so difficult that staying is no longer viable. What makes this shift particularly significant is its connection to history. Britain's colonial past created the very migration patterns we see today. Yet the country is now turning its back on people from regions it once controlled and exploited. Today, we're going to examine why the UK historically attracted asylum seekers, how current policies are pushing them out, and what this has to do with the legacy of the British Empire. To understand the current situation, we first need to understand why so many people sought refuge in the UK in the first place. After World War II, the United Kingdom became a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention, an international agreement that established legal protections for people fleeing persecution. This meant that anyone who could prove they faced serious danger in their home country had the right to claim asylum in the UK. For decades, this framework provided real protection. People who were granted asylum could rebuild their lives, access healthcare through the National Health Service, send their children to school, and eventually apply for permanent residency and citizenship. But it wasn't just about legal protections. The UK offered economic stability that many other countries didn't. Even during difficult economic periods, Britain had established social systems, employment opportunities, and a welfare safety net. For someone fleeing violence or persecution, this represented not just safety from immediate danger, but the possibility of a stable future. Language also played a crucial role. English is one of the most widely spoken languages in the world, partly because of British colonization. For people from former British colonies in South Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean, arriving in the UK meant arriving in a country where they could communicate, navigate systems, and find work more easily than in non-English-speaking European countries. Established migrant communities made integration easier too. When asylum seekers arrived, they often found communities from their home regions already living in British cities. These communities provided support networks, cultural familiarity, and practical help with housing and employment. This made the difficult process of starting over in a new country slightly less overwhelming. But perhaps the most significant factor was historical ties created during the British Empire. This is where the story becomes more complex and more important. The British Empire was one of the largest empires in human history. At its peak, in the early 20th century, it controlled roughly a quarter of the world's land and population. This included vast territories across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and the Pacific. The empire wasn't just about political control, it fundamentally reshaped economies, societies, and population movements across the globe. Colonial rule created deep connections between Britain and its colonies. The empire extracted resources, controlled trade, and moved labor across its territories to serve British economic interests. Indentured laborers from India were sent to work on plantations in the Caribbean and East Africa. People from across the empire were recruited to fight in British wars. Colonial education systems taught millions of people to speak English and learn British history and culture. These weren't natural connections, they were engineered by imperial policy. When the empire began to collapse after World War II, these connections didn't simply disappear. People from former colonies had been taught to see Britain as the mother country, the center of civilization and opportunity. Many had fought for Britain in the war. They had family members who had migrated for work. They spoke English. They understood British systems. So when independence came, or when conflicts arose in newly independent nations, it was natural that people looked to Britain as a destination. If you're interested in understanding how history shapes modern political issues, subscribing to this channel means you'll get more content exploring these often overlooked connections. And if this perspective is new to you, sharing this video helps spread awareness about these important historical contexts. Let's look at some concrete examples. The Windrush generation is perhaps the most famous case. In 1948, the British government actively invited people from Caribbean colonies to come to the UK to help rebuild the country after World War II. The economy needed workers, and the government turned to its colonies. Thousands came, legally, with full rights to settle. They worked in the NHS, in transport, in manufacturing. They built post-war Britain. Yet decades later, many of these same people and their descendants were threatened with deportation because the government couldn't prove their legal status, documentation that the Home Office itself had destroyed. This scandal revealed the contradiction at the heart of British immigration policy. People were wanted when their labour was needed, but treated as unwelcome when political winds changed. Another example is the Chagos Islanders. Between the 1960s and 70s, Britain forcibly removed the entire population of the Chagos Islands in the Indian Ocean to make way for a US military base. These people were British subjects, removed from their homeland by the British government, and many ended up seeking refuge and compensation in the UK itself. This is colonial displacement, creating asylum claims within the very country that caused the displacement. The partition of India in 1947, which created Pakistan and later Bangladesh, was overseen by British colonial administrators. The rushed and poorly planned division led to mass violence, displacement, and ongoing conflicts that continue to generate refugees today. Britain drew the borders, yet when people flee the consequences of those borders, they're told they're not Britain's responsibility. The same pattern repeats across Africa. British colonial rule in Kenya, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Sudan, and Nigeria created ethnic tensions, economic disruption, and political instability that persist decades after independence. When violence erupts, or authoritarian governments crack down on their people, refugees flee, and many have historical, linguistic, and familial ties to the UK. Here's the crucial point. Britain benefited enormously from empire. Wealth extracted from colonies funded British development. Colonial labour built British infrastructure. Colonial soldiers fought British wars. Colonial markets enriched British businesses. The prosperity and stability that made Britain attractive to asylum seekers was built, in significant part, on the exploitation of the very regions those asylum seekers come from. The United Kingdom's approach to asylum has undergone a radical transformation in recent years. What was once a pathway to protection and permanent settlement has become a system designed to deter, delay, and ultimately remove people seeking safety. The most significant changes came through policy reforms implemented between 2024 and 2025. These reforms fundamentally altered what it means to receive asylum in the UK. Previously, someone granted refugee status could begin rebuilding their life immediately, with a clear pathway to permanent residency and eventually citizenship. Now, the system operates on the principle of temporary protection. Under the new framework, asylum seekers who are granted protection receive only temporary permission to stay. This protection must be renewed repeatedly, and there's no guarantee it will be extended. The pathway to permanent residency has been dramatically lengthened. In some cases, people now face waiting periods of up to 10 years or more before they can even apply for settled status. And for many, that pathway has been removed entirely. This creates a state of permanent uncertainty. Imagine fleeing violence, finally receiving protection after months or years of waiting, and then being told you can only stay temporarily. You can't plan a future, you can't commit to education or career development, you can't bring your family to join you. You exist in limbo, never knowing if you'll be forced to leave. Family reunion rights have been severely restricted as well. Previously, refugees could apply to bring their spouse and children to the UK to live in safety together. This recognized the basic human right to family life. But recent policy changes have made this process far more difficult and in many cases impossible. Refugees are now required to meet strict financial requirements that are nearly impossible to satisfy when you're not allowed to work properly, or when you're stuck in temporary accommodation. The result is that families remain separated indefinitely, with children growing up without parents or parents living continents away from their children. The government's stated reasoning for these changes is to reduce what they call pull factors. The argument is that if the UK makes asylum less attractive, fewer people will attempt to come here, and this will reduce irregular migration. But this logic ignores a fundamental reality. People fleeing persecution aren't weighing destination options like consumers choosing products. They're running for their lives. The evidence shows that asylum seekers' knowledge of specific policies in destination countries is often limited, and even when they are aware, the decision to flee is driven by danger, not by comparing welfare benefits or settlement rights. What these policies actually achieve is the creation of a hostile environment for people who have already arrived and been recognized as needing protection. They don't stop people from fleeing danger. They just make their lives harder once they reach safety. The policy changes are only part of the story. The UK government has also dramatically increased enforcement measures designed to remove asylum seekers from the country. Deportations and removals have increased significantly. When asylum claims are rejected, the government now moves much more quickly to detain and deport individuals. Immigration detention centres, which human rights organisations have long criticised as prison-like facilities, are being used more extensively. People are held, sometimes for months, in locked facilities while awaiting removal flights to their home countries or third countries. But it's not just formal deportations. The government has also expanded what it calls voluntary returns programs. These programs offer financial assistance to asylum seekers who agree to return to their home countries. On paper, this sounds voluntary. In practice, it often isn't. When you've been living in limbo for years, when you're housed in substandard accommodation, when you can't work legally, when you're facing potential detention, and when an official offers you money to leave, that's not really a free choice. It's pressure disguised as assistance. The living conditions for asylum seekers have deteriorated sharply. Many are housed in hotels, sometimes for years, with multiple families sharing rooms, no cooking facilities, and no privacy. Others are placed in accommodation centres that are isolated from communities, making it nearly impossible to access legal help, healthcare, or support networks. Children are growing up in hotel rooms. Families are unable to cook their own food. People are living in a state of suspended existence. The delays in processing asylum claims have become extraordinary. Some people wait years for an initial decision. During this time, they're not allowed to work, which means they're entirely dependent on minimal government support. They can't study, they can't plan, they can't integrate. And all the while, the uncertainty takes a severe psychological toll. Studies have shown that prolonged asylum processes cause significant mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, and trauma symptoms. This combination of harsh conditions, long delays, and constant uncertainty creates an environment where many asylum seekers feel they have no choice but to leave, even without formal deportation. Some return to danger. Others move to different European countries where they hope for better treatment. The UK government can then claim these people left voluntarily. But the reality is that they were pushed out by policies designed to make staying unbearable. And this connects directly back to the communities most affected. Many of those facing these harsh policies come from former British colonies. They come from countries where Britain's historical actions created the instability they're fleeing from. And now they're being told they're not welcome in the country that once ruled theirs. These policy changes haven't happened in a vacuum. They're taking place against a backdrop of intense public debate and, in some cases, hostility toward asylum seekers. In various towns and cities across England, there have been protests against asylum seeker accommodation. When the government houses asylum seekers in hotels or accommodation centres, local residents have sometimes organised demonstrations. These protests often focus on concerns about pressure on local services, housing availability, and changes to community character. In some cases, these concerns reflect genuine anxieties about underfunded public services, but they also reflect misinformation about asylum seekers and what they're entitled to. Political rhetoric has intensified these tensions. Politicians across the spectrum, but particularly on the right, have increasingly blamed migrants and asylum seekers for problems in housing, healthcare, and the economy. Phrases like invasion, swarms, and floods are used to describe people seeking safety. This language dehumanizes asylum seekers and creates a political environment where harsh policies become not just acceptable, but demanded. The debate often focuses on numbers and costs while ignoring context. Yes, asylum applications increased in recent years, but the UK still receives far fewer asylum seekers than many other European countries. France, Germany, and Spain all receive significantly more applications. When you account for population size, the UK ranks in the middle of European countries, not at the top. The narrative of being overwhelmed doesn't match the statistical reality. There's also been significant pushback. Human rights organizations, refugee charities, faith groups, and many ordinary citizens have protested against the government's hostile policies. Legal challenges have blocked some of the most extreme measures. Communities have organized to welcome asylum seekers and provide support that the government won't. But these voices often struggle to be heard over the louder political rhetoric about deterrence and control. What's striking is how little the public debate focuses on why people are seeking asylum in the first place, or on Britain's historical role in creating the conditions that force people to flee. The conversation is almost entirely about how to keep people out, not about responsibility or humanity. Let's bring all of this together and confront the central contradiction. Britain built an empire that spanned the globe. For centuries, British colonial administrators, soldiers, traders, and settlers moved freely across territories that Britain controlled. They extracted resources, reorganized economies, drew borders, and made decisions that affected millions of lives. When Britain needed labor, it moved people from India to the Caribbean, from Africa to other parts of Africa, across an empire designed to serve British interests. When Britain fought wars, it recruited soldiers from across its colonies. The wealth and development that made Britain prosperous was built, in significant part, on colonial exploitation. That empire created the migration patterns we see today. English became a global language because Britain imposed it on colonies. People from South Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean have connections to Britain because Britain colonized their countries. The conflicts and instability in many of these regions have roots in colonial rule, from hastily drawn borders to economic systems designed to extract wealth rather than build sustainable development. When Britain benefited from empire, movement was encouraged. Labor was brought in when needed. After World War II, people from the Caribbean were actively invited to rebuild Britain. They were British subjects with every right to be there. But when that labor was no longer needed, or when political attitudes shifted, those same people and their descendants faced hostility and even deportation. Now, when people from former colonies seek safety in Britain, they face some of the harshest asylum policies in Europe. They're housed in detention-like conditions. They're denied the right to work. They wait years for decisions. Their families are kept separated. And increasingly, they're being told to leave, either through deportation or through conditions designed to make staying impossible. This raises fundamental questions about responsibility. If Britain benefited from empire, does it not have some obligation to people from those same regions when they face crisis? If British colonialism contributed to instability in South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, does Britain not bear some responsibility when people flee that instability? If Britain moved people around the world for its own benefit, can it now simply close its doors when those people or their descendants seek safety? These aren't just historical questions. They're immediate moral questions about how we understand responsibility, humanity, and justice in the present day. The current approach treats asylum seekers as burdens to be minimized rather than people to be protected. It prioritizes deterrence over dignity. It responds to people fleeing persecution with policies designed to make their lives so difficult that they'll give up and leave. And it does all of this while ignoring the historical context that created the very migration patterns these policies attempt to stop. Britain cannot simply benefit from empire and then wash its hands of the consequences. History doesn't work that way. The wealth is still here. The institutions built on colonial exploitation still exist. But the people seeking safety from regions Britain once controlled are being turned away. So here's the question we should all be asking. In a world shaped by colonial history, what responsibility do former imperial powers have to people from regions they once exploited? And can a country truly claim to uphold human rights and humanitarian values while implementing policies specifically designed to force vulnerable people to leave? These are uncomfortable questions, but they're necessary ones. Because the current policies aren't just failing asylum seekers, they're revealing fundamental contradictions about how Britain sees itself and its place in the world.